Hello everybody. So this is going to be a video that speaks about throwing and particularly the centering process, which will of course be the start to any throwing project that you might have. Since centering is the first step, we're going to go through a couple things that you're going to need to do this. First, let's start with the tools. So we'd like to have a wire tool. I don't know if you can see that there. So wire tool. Ribs of various sorts. Mine happen to be colors, doesn't matter. Metal, wood, plastic, metal, whatever you like. Your kit will have a variety. Have all of them in front of you. And do remember that indoors on the communal tool wall, there are some others to try out that look a little bit more like this. They'll have a little bit of a different attitude, so feel free to try those out. I'm also going to have this here. So this is the serrated rib. Mine is a different shape, but you have that as well. And a wooden knife. And a sponge. This will be for delivering water to the clay, this smaller sponge, and I also have a big cleanup sponge just to mop my hands clean when I need to use them for something else. I also recommend having a towel nearby. A small hand towel will do fine, just to dry those hands. That keeps you sort of taking less trips to the sink. And of course I have a container. This is full of water, fresh water, by the way. So here is the wheel head. This is going to look a little different from what we have going at ISU at school. And I'll let you know ahead of the video that my wheel makes a terrible racket, makes a fair amount of noise. So hopefully you'll be able to hear my voice over it. Okay, so I have a wheel head here, and this is the wheel head. This is what we'll refer to that as. Mine has a plastic cover on it, so this is the raw metal wheel head. You guys, at least to start with, will be throwing right straight directly on the wheel head. So just ignore this. This is called a bat. Ignore this plastic bat for now. All right, let's get started. So I have a lump of clay prepared here. This is a little bit larger probably than my two fists put together. Probably just a little larger than that. That's what I'm going to be starting with today, and that's mostly so you can see what's happening just a little bit better. But I would recommend starting out that you work with a piece of clay that's about as big as your two fists put together. Okay, so the wheel head is dry, it's clean, it's not dusty. If you want to wipe that off with a sponge, just to be sure, it's never a bad idea, but do follow it up with the towel and make sure that that is not slippery. Make sure that's not slippery and doesn't have any standing water on it. So I'm going to put this piece of clay into, kind of a cone shape, something roughly like that. It could be spherical, it could be cone shaped. What's important is that it's roughly symmetrical and that it's got a convex surface on the bottom where it's going to meet up with the wheel head. Some people like to do this just a little bit, just to roll that on the wheel head, which definitely gives that a really slick convex surface for applying to the wheel head. Okay, so I'm just going to set that down there in the middle. And as I get started here, I usually begin with a little bit of pounding to kind of pound the clay roughly into center before I even get started with water or anything like that. Undoubtedly, many of you have seen this process, either on television or maybe you've seen it in person. Some of you have probably even done this process. For those of you who are well versed in centering, I guess you could skip the video, but it's always good to refresh, right? Anyway, get a handle on your wheel. There are slower and faster speeds on the pedal. Just like a car, there probably is a high range that you never really have to get to unless you're in trouble. And it's that low range that you want to kind of, just get comfortable with before you get started. Just play with the pedal a little bit. Our wheel should always be going counterclockwise. So just check that and be sure. The wheels at school will have a switch down below where you can turn that switch and get that turning in a different direction if you needed to. So counterclockwise is what we want to be doing. All right, so I'm going to start just by slowly rotating that wheel. I'm going to start hitting the clay in towards the center point. And you should be able to see a center point on your wheel head, or imagine it anyway. And the act of centering is bringing the clay toward that center point, condensing it as much as possible, and eliminating any irregularities that might be moving around orbitally speaking as this spins. So, for example, that is an irregularity, obviously, right? This point right here is jutting out further than everything else, and as it rotates, that is showing us that quite obviously. So that would be a bad way to start. That sort of puts a little bit more work on us to begin with, and we don't really want that. So let me pound that back into something that's a little closer to center to begin with. And what I usually end up with is this kind of conical shape. That's usually what I end up starting with. If you have any big creases or folds in the clay, you want to try to use this kind of pounding method to get rid of those. If something's kind of extreme, you could even kind of reach in and sort of stitch it up, so to speak. So I have a big crease right here. I might just kind of touch that a little bit just to make sure I don't trap any air or anything funny like that. All right, so let's now start with the water. So I'm going to get this spinning at a little bit of a higher speed. I think you can see that that's moving a little faster now. The centering process typically is at these higher speeds, and when we move to opening and then building the wall, which are the other two main steps of throwing an object, a pot if you will, those two processes are going to be a little bit of a slower speed. All right, so to start with, just get your hands nice and wet down. Go ahead and give a little ladle full of water right to the clay. You can see that's good and slick down. The clay should be reflective and shiny and slippery at all times, for sure. So the first thing that I'm going to do, and again, centering is trying to bring that clay inward always, condensing it towards that imagined center point. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is I'm just going to grip from either side. I'm going to put my thumbs on top of the mass here, and I'm going to squeeze inward and press down. As that rotates through my hands. Now pretty quickly I can feel, especially up at the top of the clay, feel it dry out just a little bit. And I felt my thumbs kind of maybe scraping the surface. Just give it another drop of water, and you'll be doing this periodically all the way through the throwing process. All right, the next thing that I'm going to do, now that I've squeezed down and inward, is I'm actually going to squeeze just from the sides. If you can imagine this happening, the clay has nowhere to go except for up. So let's see what that looks like. Particular wheel that I'm working on really bogs down when I squeeze the clay, so not a whole lot of speed stays there, but yours should keep going pretty fast. Okay, so we squeezed inward from the sides. It's risen just a little bit. You can see there's still some problems here, some odd bits kind of floating around. But down here you can see it's a little bit more regular already. It's starting to be kind of more like a lathe down in that area, so that's good. So I'm going to repeat that first step again, where I squeeze from the sides and push down with the thumbs. That's going to bring the clay down, make that much lower. Now don't squash it all the way flat. It's very difficult if that happens to bring that back up. We want to end up, with it being roughly the same height as it is wide when we're all centered. And we don't want to squash that down too terribly flat. So I'm going to stop right there. And then I'm going to go back to this gesture where I'm going to squeeze from either side. That's going to rise up ever so slightly. And we're going to repeat that process again. I'm just going to squeeze that one more time. Okay. So often when you're throwing, you can see when you kind of change the shape or move an irregularity, right, something that's off center to another part of the form, what often happens is that irregularity will rise up. It'll move out and away from your hands. It'll migrate. It'll go to somewhere else. So then what we want to do is maybe put a hand on top. You could kind of brace the hands in this fashion. You could do this with the thumbs on top. In some way, I want to squeeze the sides as well as the top now. And you can see we're going back and forth between two general processes of squeezing downward and then from the sides. Back and forth between those two. And eventually all the irregularities are gone. And as far as on the screen, what we will see is that it's just not, there aren't any lumps, there aren't any movement to it. It'll look as if it's totally still, even though you'll be able to tell that the wheel is actually still spinning. All right, so let's get a little bit more serious here. I'm gonna squeeze, I'm gonna try and open up what I'm doing so you can see my hands. So I'm gonna squeeze from the sides. Here you can see my hands are a little bit out of parallel from one another. So my left hand is a little higher than the right hand. And I'm also, as I squeeze, I'm gonna let that pressure rise up the sides of the form. I'm gonna let that just rise up very slowly. And depending on the speed of the wheel, that rise will actually, see if we can do this, will actually scribe a line on the actual form of the clay, showing you how fast you're rising. So if those marks are very, very close together, as they are here, my hand is rising pretty slow. Let me just make that blank again. And if I have my hand rise pretty quickly, right, those marks show that they're pretty far apart. So we don't want to be moving quite that fast. Actually, that can create twist and torque in the clay, and we want to actually have the hands rise quite a bit more slowly. With my right hand fingertips, I'm kind of combing the outside surface of the clay. And then when I get to the top, I'll usually just finish off the top. Just with my thumbs on top, I'll kind of squeeze and push down just a little bit. Okay. So that's decent. It's kind of roughly centered, I would say, at this point. Depending on what you're going to be making, so if you're going to be making a more taller vertical object, you might want it centered much like this. It's a little bit vertical. If you're going to make a lower, wider object, you might want to center the piece of clay more so down here, so a little bit lower. For example, if I was going to make like a low bowl or some kind of vessel of that kind, I want to center it more so like this. But I'm actually going to be throwing more of a cylindrical shape. Which is going to be a little taller than it is wide overall. So I'm going to center the clay kind of more so here, a little bit taller. Like I said before, this is more clay than you're going to be working with, at least for starters, for you beginning throwers, and probably for the assignment that we're going to be working on as well. We're going to be working on some drinking vessels. Okay, so a couple quick things just in closing. The centering process can be challenging, can take a number of tries to start to get it under your belt as something that you can possibly do. Here's just a couple quick things that can really hopefully help out. So again, if we're moving our fingers along the mass of the clay and we're rising along with the speed of the wheel very, very slowly, it's much like a needle on a record. It will touch and track all along the surface of the clay and record a mark there. And I don't know if you can see those, but those are very, very close together marks. The closer together the marks are, the more surface area you're actually hitting as the piece is spinning around. And that's going to give you more control. If your hands are darting around and kind of moving quickly, so for example, if I have this happen many times and that begins to compound, I'm going to get really kind of twisted, torqued, kind of an upside down tornado style like piece of clay. And while that's interesting to look at, it's not very easy to make something from this and stay in control. So this is not the sort of thing that we want to have happening. Anytime you're getting a kind of spiral on the surface like this, remember that you can cancel that spiral out by simply reversing the way that spiral is going. So if the wheel's always turning counterclockwise, and that happened from our hand rising up the mass of clay, we can start at the top with the same pressure, move that downward, those spirals will crisscross and cancel each other out. So let's see if that's actually true. So I'm going to start up at the top here, kind of a focused pressure, and I'm going to move downward pretty quickly, just as I did the first time. And that's kind of difficult to do. You're jumping over all of those bumps and valleys. Do that again. Do that again. What you can start to see happening is that the surface now is starting to become more smooth, and the actual form of the clay is starting to be more so back on center. So that law, I think I'll call it a law or kind of an unwritten rule of the spiral, canceling itself out if we cast the spiral in the other direction is a really useful thing to be able to do. It can get you out of trouble if you should get into trouble, but also remember, it's really useful to just be judicious about what's going on, and if you're really in trouble and it's gotten really out of hand, just cut that piece of clay off and start again. All right, so I would call that centered right there, and that looks pretty good to me. So from this, you should be able to make lots of things as long as you can keep the piece on center as you go and stay in control. So good luck.